So let's talk about the history of economic thought on poverty. And this discussion is borrowed extensively from the book by Martin Revalian, The Economics of Poverty. The book is with me here. You can see it's a thick book, but I have assigned only chapter 1 of this book to you guys because um, that chapter sort of broadly discusses the concept related to poverty, which is what we have done previously, but also has this very nice discussion on the evolution of the idea of the social attitude towards poverty. So, if you look at early philosophers, starting with Aristotle, during that time, even philosophers across various societies had a disagreement in terms of whether poverty-free society is desirable. So, from the Aristotle's point of view, um, hierarchy in society is actually efficient. So he talked about slavery as part of an efficient hierarchical system of society. So he sort of was of the view that poverty is probably an efficient solution in order to maintain order and achieve productive efficiency. However, if you sort of go to another part of the world, in Asia, Confucius and Kautilya around the sort of similar time were of a different point of view. They called for intervention to reduce poverty because they thought that poverty should not be there. But the reason for poverty reduction through government intervention was very different across Confucius and Kautilya. So for Confucius, there was a kind of a very moral standpoint in the sense that he thought that poverty is one of the 6 calamities of society, and government should reduce it. On the point of view of Kautilya, it was kind of a much more strategic advice to the king, in the sense that incidents of high poverty may lead to social unrest and instability in the kingdom. So that sort of is coming from that strategic point of view. If you look at the writings of the philosophers and sort of the so-called intellectual thinkers during 16th to early 18th century, they had a very different notion of poverty than what we have here today. Uh, uh, so, for example, think about this quote by Bernard de Mandeville, writing in 1732. He says, "It is manifest that in free nations where slaves are not allowed of, the surest wealth consists in a multitude of laborious poor. For besides that, they are never a failing nursery of fleets and armies. Without them, there could be no enjoyment, and no product of any country could be valuable." So he's saying that poverty and poor people are necessary for the society to prosper, have an army also in terms of security, and for the society to enjoy relative prosperity. And that's sort of a very clever ploy where he sort of uses this aggregate notion of enjoyment, production, security. Um, but what effectively he is talking about is sort of the elites, right? So it's the elites who enjoys the fruits of labor from poor, but he gives the spin that it's the society that sort of benefits from having poor people. Um, Elites during this time, they proposed the utility of poverty idea. So their idea was that increasing wage may actually reduce labor, and they raised it from a both moral as well as from economic point of view. So they were saying that if you give higher wages to work to laborers, they'll spend the money in drinking alcohol, and they'll sort of become lazy, and they'll become unmotivated. So in order to keep them industrious, so to speak, you have to keep them poor. You have to keep their wages low. Okay, so that's sort of is the moral argument for having low wages for workers. The economic reason was that if we give higher wages, they're gonna enjoy more leisure, because leisure is going to become more expensive. So wage is like a price on leisure, and you can think about sort of this economic model that you learned in your first semester micro about labor leisure choice. In this sort of XY space where X is consumption and Y is leisure, and a higher wage sort of gives you more income and hence can fund more consumption, so you can increase your leisure. So what implicitly from the economic point of view, what elites at that time were proposing is that the income effect of having higher wage is going to dominate the substitution effect. What do you mean by substitution effect? Substitution effect is that given that the price is now higher for leisure, they're going to reduce leisure, right? So they're going to now that you're going to get higher wage for every hour that you work. If you enjoy more hours at home, you're going to leave out a greater sum of money on the table. So the income effect, which is the inclination to enjoy more time now that you have more income, is going to dominate the substitution effect to work more now that you have wages. So that was sort of the economic rationale that sort of is implicit in the kind of arguments that they were proposing, over and above the moral arguments, which was kind of one of the important thrusts of this utility of poverty idea. This sort of desirability of poverty in society, the intellectual thought around this started changing towards late 18th century, when philosophers such as Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant, and then with Adam Smith coming in 1776, started questioning this idea. There were also widespread poverty at that time, and sort of very durable poverty at that time, so that it became sort of morally a very deep, untenable position to take for thinking people. So for example, Adam Smith wrote in 1776, no society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. So his definition of society is now different. He is including the poor people in his definition of society, unlike the Mandeville definition. Okay. However, Adam Smith was kind of optimistic about economic growth leading to reduction in poverty, which was later questioned at the beginning of 19th century by people like Malthus and Smith. Malthus and Ricardo. So Malthus' point is that of course wage may increase due to availability of better productive technology, but any increase in wages for the poor would lead to increase in fertility, and that will sort of lead to, again, on average, it will reduce the resource available to poor. And that sort of gave rise to this idea that government should intervene in a sustained way to reduce poverty, because just sheer economic market forces is not going to deal with this issue. So Ricardo in 1807 talks about government taxation for redistribution. In France, Thomas Paine advocated for having land tax, because natural resources was seen as something that is sort of accessible and available to everybody in society. So even if it is individually owned by the big landlords, there should be taxes on land which should be distributed equally across society. So everybody can gain from a country having more agricultural land, for example. Condorcet similarly argued for free public schooling. So this idea of that government that society should deal with the issue of poverty, that economic forces is not going to reduce poverty on its own, and there should be specific policies undertaken by government, such as taxing natural resources such as agricultural land or having free public schooling, is important to attack this problem. One of the earliest empirical work trying to investigate what it means to be poor is by Frederick in the book The State of Poor, written in 1797. Um, certain important redistributive laws became very prominent societal debates in England and in US. So, for example, the poor law, which sort of talks about giving foods to poor people, and uh, 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 the post-Civil War in the United States, where there were redistribution towards African Americans by the United States government, became important redistributive policies that set the precedent for the government to have long-term plans about reducing policy through state intervention. Um, One can think about what changed this intellectual thinking about poverty. How is it that we had this transition from having poverty seen as socially desirable by the intellectual elite to being something undesirable and to be removed from society. And one aspect could be sheer the incidence of extreme poverty became a morally untenable position to sort of back by the thinking elite, at least by some of them. But also, there were sort of important historical forces at play. Because the poverty became widespread, there were a lot of political mobilization around the poor, especially because industrial revolution was taking place, which was a big disruption to society. It changed the nature of production. It moved people away from the rural hinterland and moved to cities, and there were a lot of churning happening in society, which sort of was an ideal situation for a society to be in for its disadvantaged people to seek changes in lives for themselves. As they saw that the entire nature of society being sort of going through this kind of transition, they thought that they should have a part of they should sort of benefit from this transition in terms of upward social mobility. So a lot of political mobilization of poor happened around this time. The French Revolution happened in 1789, which sort of changed uh, the relationship between a citizen and state in terms of having a more democratic structure. And similarly in the United States, similarly in UK as well. So the fact that intellectuals change their stand on poverty is not automatic or it's not natural. There are important societal and political changes that need to take place for the intellectual to sort of start aligning themselves with that majority. So it's an important lesson to keep in mind, because we want our sort of thinkers in society sort of to set the agenda to guide the thinking around policy making, but we also have to keep in mind that elites tend to align themselves with the status quo power of the society, and they'll change their attitude only when they see that ground beneath them is shifting differently. So, sort of that's an important lesson from the history of evolution of poverty. Now, now that you see this whole intellectual attitude towards poverty changing, which definitely was also sort of concomitant with states in Western Europe and in the United States implementing important pro-poor policies. You see subsequently the poverty rate declined substantially in these countries during the sort of 19th and 20th century. So here you see in the graph that, for example, European countries like France, Germany, and also in the United States, poverty rates declined, even though they were pretty high towards the beginning of the 19th century. You see Japan is kind of staying stable till towards the towards the later half of the 1800s, and then started falling. They had this major restoration happening in 1870s, and that sort of again an important societal level organizational institutional change that resulted in this kind of fall from poverty. So, the graph that I showed before uses a specific standard definition of poverty and applies it retrospectively to get at this measure over time, which sort of begs the question, what is the right way to measure poverty? We talked about income-based poverty and absolute versus relative poverty, even in the income poverty concept. Um, how should we go about measuring absolute and relative deprivation? Uh, the reference for this is again uh, 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 this time by Martin Revalian, an article written by him on measuring global poverty. The year written is incorrect; it should be 2020. It came out very recently in Annual Review of Economics. So I'm sort of borrowing the discussions from there. So there are two main approaches: the absolute measure and the relative measure, tackling the absolute notion of poverty and the relative notion of poverty. So in the absolute measure, countries come up with poverty lines, and the World Bank, which is trying to capture global poverty across countries, came up with one specific poverty line to be applied everywhere uniformly. And the idea is that people who fall below this poverty line, which is the sort of monetary amount expressed in local currencies per capita per day, and so if your income is below, if your income or often it is computed using consumption, if your consumption is below this poverty line, then you are considered poor, and that's how that's how most countries measure, most developing countries measure poverty in this absolute sense. In terms of relative measure, the way to think about relative measure is to think about again a poverty line, but poverty line not expressed as say rupees per day for an individual, but in terms of being set as a constant proportion of the current mean or median of the national income. So you can say that the people who have consumption or income which is half of the median of the below the half of the median of the national income are considered poor. So again, here the idea is that as the country grows rich, the median is going to shift up, and so the 50% of the median is also going to shift up. So people below that 50% is going to continuously be sort of referred to as people being relatively poor. Now, what is the idea behind it? Idea again is that relative income is important for two reasons. So that's the question that I'm asking is the next bullet. Does relative income of individuals in a country matter for well-being? And the idea is that yes, it does, in the sense that as the country becomes more prosperous, a lot of things which was previously affordable to a person of a given income may become unaffordable. So, for example, housing can become unaffordable when the society prospers. The house rents go up; it becomes more expensive to buy houses. So that can lead to deprivation. But also equally importantly, even if you're able to afford the minimum set of goods and services for you to attain this minimum set of capabilities, maybe there are other capabilities which get hampered. For example, you may have a lot of social isolation if you remain relatively poor, even if your absolute income remains same. Okay, so even if you are relatively affluent, if other people become significantly rich, it may be hard for you to participate in your community without sharing. Remember, that's an important element in capability, and therefore, relative income can have absolute deprivation in terms of your capacity to attain certain goals that you value intrinsically. Now, if absolute measures are important as well as relative measures are important, then neither, if both absolute poverty as well as relative poverty are important to sort of determine your overall well-being, then it, just looking at absolute measure or just looking at relative measure may not suffice. It may not suffice, just looking at absolute measure may not suffice for understandable reason, because you can be above the absolute poverty line, but you can still be relatively poor, right? But however, even if you are, even if you, but if you only use the relative measure, even then it's possible that you could be absolutely poor, even though you are relatively not poor. Imagine, people in very poor countries. There, even if you say above the 50% of the median income, even then, your income is still below $1 per day. And there are countries where it is indeed true that even if you remain, say, above the 50% of the median income, you are still, you'd be still absolutely poor using the, say, the $1 per day benchmark that World Bank uses. So therefore, if you only use relative measure, even then you might be losing out poor people, and not only you will be losing out poor people, you will be losing out poor people, especially in poor countries. Okay, so it can be dangerous to move completely away from absolute measures. The World Bank has started using this $1 per day as the absolute measure to capture global poverty and its movement over time. And this has sort of been picked up in the media, and it sort of has become a standard statistic that people look at. Of course, national countries use different national poverty lines. And so, um, oops, yeah. So you see this graph that Ravalian reports, where in the x-axis you have the mean per person per day income of that country, and on the y-axis you have the poverty line of that country. You see a strong positive relationship. So it is indeed the case that richer countries have a higher uh, um, poverty line. So you have to earn more to be considered not poor in a rich country. One exception, of course, is US, which has a quite a low poverty line relative to the income that it has compared to other countries of similar income. Let's talk about these national poverty lines. So in developing countries, poverty lines are based on nutritional standards. So this is sort of, they focus on one specific functioning, so to speak, one specific capability to be attained, which is these nutritional standards that all individuals must meet in order to remain, not fall sick. And these nutritional standards are set globally by, say, the World Health Organization. And then what developing countries find compute is the minimum cost food bundle that you need to consume in order to attain that kind of a nutritional standard. So what is the minimum expenditure you need to meet to attain a nutritional standard? Okay, and that is used as the poverty line of the country. So again, it's an absolute poverty. It's an absolute definition of poverty line. It captures absolute poverty, and it captures absolute poverty with respect to a very specific dimension of poverty, which is nutrition. And the way it sort of compensates for the other dimension is by adding a multiplier to account for other expenses. So for example, you can say that food expenditure, say, is 1/3 of your total expense as computed from, say, household surveys. Then you multiply the income equivalent of the food standard with 3, because you know that the other expenses need to be with the ratio of 2:1 in order for you to have that kind of nutritional standard met, because you need to be spending money on other stuff as well. So then the income or the expenditure poverty line or the consumption poverty line will be 3 times the income equivalent of the nutritional standard. Okay. Now, um, so that sort of gives you in a given country, in a given year, what would be the national poverty line, okay, using this kind of computation method. Of course, over the years, you have to adjust for inflation to ensure that you are still sort of looking at people who are comparable in terms of real income and real consumption over time. And again, the question arises is what kind of price index to use to account for inflation. The consumer price index uses the mean food bundle, the mean consumption bundle of the country in order to compute the inflation figures. And one could say that that's not ideal because people who are poor may face very different prices than the average individual in a country. Therefore, it could be that the inflation experienced by the poor is probably higher than the inflation experienced by the average person in the country. And therefore, we should think about using a different kind of price index targeted primarily to adjust the poverty line for the purposes of adjusting the poverty line. Some researchers have done that, and one interesting finding is that it doesn't change the computation very much, which is sort of a good news. Now, even if you are able to do this inflation adjustment properly, coming up with welfare consistent global poverty line is hard because it's not clear, why higher countries, richer countries have a higher poverty line. It could either be because things are more expensive, so housing is more expensive in a rich country than in a poor country, or it could also be because higher countries have a higher ethical standards. They set a higher benchmark in terms of they set a more expansive set of capabilities that I think is the minimum essential for you to attain in order to escape poverty. And it's not clear which one of these is what's driving this positive relationship between per capita income of a country and the poverty line of the country. So in absence of this kind of an understanding, what you are left with is sort of an imperfect measure of poverty lines or imperfect measure of poverty. So either you use the absolute poverty to get a sense of the lower bound on the incidence of poverty, or you use the relative measure to get an upper bound on the welfare consistent global poverty. So the true poverty measure probably lies somewhere in the two, but it's hard to identify what it is. So this is sort of a bit of a formalization of this idea of how to combine the two concept of absolute and relative poverty measure in sort of one poverty measure. So the idea that relative deprivation matters is important, and therefore we should not only look at absolute poverty lines, and we should have some component of relativism built into the poverty lines. And this is actually followed in many OECD countries. So the question is, how do you build into it? So one idea is to have just relative measure, which I refer to as the strongly relative poverty line. So this is represented by this value ZR. Z is the poverty line, R means relative, which is a fraction kappa of the income of the pi-th percentile. So pi z is the percentile income distribution. So say you want to be half of the median guy's income. So median means pi is 0.5, right? So that's the 50th percentile is the median. And y of pi z is the income of the median person. So it's the inverse of the CTF. Okay? Sometimes it's referred to as the percentile function. So y of 0.5 will give you the income say in India it will be rupees, how many rupees is earned by the person who sits in the median of the income distribution. Okay, and suppose our goal is to look at who are the people who earn or consume less than half of the median person's income or consumption. So kappa is also 0.5. So 0.5 of y of 0.5 will give you the half of the income or the consumption of the median guy, and that is your relative measure of poverty. That is your relative poverty. Okay? And one way to combine the absolute and the relative is to do this equation which we refer to as weakly relative poverty line. Weakly relative because I have some concept of absolute motion built into it. So ZA is, say, the absolute poverty line. So this is the minimum income you need in order to escape certain very basic nutritional requirements, and then your actual poverty line is a combination of your absolute poverty line of the country plus some fraction times the gap between the median and the absolute. So as the median increases of a country, you change your poverty estimate, you change your ZR accordingly. Beta is somewhere between 0 and 1. So if for every 1 rupee increase in the median income, you increase the poverty line by beta rupees. Okay. Now notice I mentioned that in poor countries the median could be less than the absolute. It could be that even the median income is so low that it's below the absolute poverty line, right? So then this equation would not work, because then ZR will be below ZA when M falls below ZA, and therefore you will end up with a poverty line which is below the absolute number. So in order to ensure that, some people have proposed this max function. So it's a max of the absolute poverty line ZA and alpha plus beta m, where alpha is some sort of positive number. This ensures that your poverty line always is at least ZA, right? So even if your M is very low in your country, even then your poverty line remains ZA, which is sort of the absolute necessary you need to escape the absolute poverty. But if your M is high enough, then you sort of, as M increases, you then increase Z in proportion of beta. Okay? So that sort of captures both the absolute and the relative, so it's called a hybrid measure. And if you sort of look at the global trend in poverty based on the absolute measure and the relative measure, where absolute is used in for the absolute, the researcher used $1.9 a day. They see a falling line falling trend under both the absolute measure as well as the hybrid measure. But of course, the hybrid measure is always above, and the gap between them is not particularly shrinking. So the fraction of the world population that remains relatively poor is sort of staying at least constant, if not increasing over time. Here they kind of decompose the global count of people who are poor based on the hybrid measure into people who are below the absolute measure, as well as people who are above the absolute measure but are relatively poor. And you see that the absolute trend is going down. So the total number of people who are absolutely poor is going down using this $1.9 a day benchmark, but people who remain relatively poor in their respective societies is going up. Okay, so the absolute number of such people is going up. So in terms of the absolute number of people who would be either absolutely or relatively poor, that number is more or less flat. Okay. So this is an interesting point, in the sense that over time, more and more people are sort of escaping absolute deprivation, but still they are not able to achieve the sort of other aspects of life that they intrinsically value. So they remain relatively poor. and that number is increasing. Let me finally point out some sort of issues with measuring some of the inputs that goes into measuring poverty. So it's sort of a second layer to it, or going even deeper into the analysis. So far we have been talking about measuring who are poor in a country based on data that different countries collect. So we have been talking about, given that data, how to measure poverty, incidence of poverty. Now we are sort of going one step behind and asking, are there issues with the collection of this data based on which these poverty measures are computed? And that is based on this very interesting paper by Angus Deaton in 2005 titled Measuring Poverty in Growing World, or Measuring Measuring Growth in Poor World. He points out that World Bank measures these absolutely poor people, this absolute poverty across countries, using consumption data from household surveys. So every household survey has the consumption, consumption surveys carried out by the sort of statistical agency of the country. And this is an important exercise because this gives researchers detailed data about the kind of bundles that various kinds of items that individuals are consuming across the country, which helps them measure people who fall below absolute poverty line. However, Deaton points out that the household surveys differ starkly from the national account statistics, which also computes consumption, while as part of the computation of GDP exercise. So as part of the GDP computation exercise, they also compute consumption, and there is consumption estimate of overall consumption in a country coming from the household surveys as well. And these two differ quite starkly. So one way to show this, Deaton uses survey data from 88 countries and says that during the periods 1987 to 1998, the real consumption per capita in the national account statistics grew at 3.3% per annum, while in the surveys it grew only 0.9% per annum. Okay, so that's a stark difference, and consequently, because absolute poverty measures are computed using the survey data and not the national account statistics, we see a very small fall in the absolute poverty during this time period. So the absolute poverty fell from 28% to about 23.5%. Okay. So if you believe the national account statistics figures, then this fall in absolute poverty is underestimated, because surveys are underestimating the growth in consumption. However, if you believe the survey figures, then you think that the growth numbers are overestimated. Okay? And he says that it is indeed true that growth among poor, so consumption growth among poor, is much lower than the consumption growth in the national consumption. Now that could be true if inequality is going up, but there is no observable changes in inequality during this time period. So it's hard to reconcile why national consumption is growing at a faster rate than the consumption of the poor people on average. And therefore it is important to understand the nature and sources of this discrepancy and its implications, so that we have a handle on what implication it has on poverty measures. So this is sort of a very, very broad point that he makes using this table. If you see, he is reporting the ratio of survey means of consumption and national means coming from the national income accounts. Okay, and you see these reports, these ratios are all less than 1, except sub-Saharan Africa. And especially in South Asia, this is really low. It's 0.65. Okay, even if you do a population weighting, this number becomes, it gets even lower. It becomes 0.57. Okay, that tells you that this discrepancy is pretty large. In order to see whether there are discrepancies, whether poor and rich countries have separate kind of discrepancies, he plots these ratios as a function of the per capita GDP of the country, and you see that uh, uh, um, the higher, the lower is the real GDP per capita, the higher is the ratio, and as you become rich, this ratio becomes smaller. Okay. But you see, when you do that for income, you don't see any pattern. It's only in income to consumption ratio remains similar across rich and poor countries. In fact, income measured from surveys to GDP again remains constant across rich and poor countries, but consumption to consumption ratio, consumption from surveys to consumption from national accounts, that ratio is falling with rich, with the overall prosperity of the countries. In fact, if you look at two big countries, India and China, which has majority of the poor people of the earth, you see that the ratio is pretty low. As I said, it's already low in South Asia. It's primarily driven by India, and it's falling over time. The ratio, the discrepancy is increasing over time. It used to be around 0.7 in 1980s, and now it has fallen to close to 0.5 in late 1990s to 2000s. Okay, and its same is true for China. So this is kind of a stark fact that why is it that the survey measures are not able to capture consumption in a way that the national account is able to capture. So let me end by discussing this. There is some issue with, yeah. So let me end by discussing these possible sources of discrepancy. So one of the important source is that in survey measures, richer households are harder to survey. So it's harder for surveyors to sort of get interviews with rich people to get their consumption details, and therefore they are systematically underrepresented in household surveys. So this is referred to as unit non-response. So household as a sort of unit of the survey, there is non-response, more likely to be non-response from richer household. And this phenomenon may be especially stark in poorer countries. Okay, in poorer countries, it could be that it's really hard to enter the gated communities where the rich live, and therefore it's really hard for the surveyors to interview the richer people in poorer countries. It's relatively easier for surveyors to access rich people in rich countries. Okay, so even the that you can sort of see why this non-response by rich people and especially so in poor countries can lead to the kind of patterns you saw previously. So it definitely explains why national accounts consumption is higher than consumption computed from this household surveys, and it also explains why the gap is increasing. The gap is increasing as the country becomes richer. Apart from unit non-response, you can also have item non-response. So even if a household is able to, the surveyor is able to reach a household, certain households may not be able to, may not be reporting truthfully consumption behavior on certain items, so such as things like alcohol or illicit goods, drugs, etc. So consumption on certain goods may remain systematically underreported in the household surveys. There are certain consumption which shows up in national accounts but do not show up in surveys. So, for example, imputed rents for owner-occupiers of home. So those who live in their own homes, they are implicitly sort of consuming the rent that they would have gotten if they had rented out their house. And this would show up in the national account statistics imputation exercise, but definitely will not be captured in household service because they do not specifically mention household rents as part of their consumption. And same is true for various kinds of financial services, which gets imputed in the national accounts but do not show up in the household service. So there are deeper issues in measurement of the variables that are critical for the measurement of poverty, right? So this is sort of a second layer of complexity about which we have to be really aware. So this tells you that you have to be really careful about the kind of data sets you're working with in order to come up with a meaningful measure of poverty such that it gives you, meaningful trends over time and gives you meaningful variation across space geographies. So you have to be aware of how this data is getting generated in the first place. So let me stop here and let's discuss various issues around both the conceptual details surrounding poverty as well as the measurement issues associated with capturing poverty in data on the Thursday's class. So see you then.